deep in the Colorado Rockies, where cell towers can't reach and civilization feels like a distant memory. Sarah Chen heard the desperate roars echoing through the pine forest. For 15 years, she'd lived off-grid in her grandfather's cabin, hiding from a past that destroyed everything she loved. As a former wildlife veterinarian who lost her license after exposing illegal animal testing, Sarah had sworn off saving anything but herself. But the sounds weren't just animal cries. They were pleas for help. She found him caught in steel leg-hold traps, a massive grizzly bear whose intelligent amber eyes seemed almost human. Blood pooled beneath the cruel metal teeth that bit deep into his flesh. Any sane person would call the rangers and walk away. Sarah wasn't sane anymore. As she worked to free him, the bear remained perfectly still, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. When the last trap clicked open, he didn't run. Instead, he touched her hand with his massive paw, and she swore she felt electricity. What Sarah didn't know was that this rescue would awaken a connection between two worlds and change the fate of everything she held dear. The bear's amber gaze held her captive for several heartbeats before he slowly turned and limped into the dense undergrowth, leaving only disturbed earth and crimson drops on fallen leaves. Sarah remained crouched beside the abandoned traps, her hands trembling from adrenaline and something else she couldn't name. She gathered the bloody steel devices, fury building in her chest. These weren't regulation traps. The serrated edges and reinforced springs were designed to cause maximum damage to ensure whatever stepped into them would never escape. Poachers, the kind who took what they wanted and left destruction in their wake. The hike back to her cabin took twice as long as usual. Sarah found herself constantly scanning the tree line, listening for sounds of the injured bear. She told herself it was professional concern, old habits from her veterinary days, but the memory of those two intelligent eyes and the electric sensation when he'd touched her hand suggested something far more complicated. Her grandfather's cabin appeared through the pines like a refuge from another time. Solar panels glinted on the roof, and the stone chimney released a thin ribbon of smoke into the crisp mountain air. This place had been her sanctuary for 15 years, ever since her world had collapsed in a courtroom in Denver. Inside, the familiar scent of wood smoke and dried herbs embraced her. She'd built a life here among her grandfather's books and her own makeshift laboratory. No colleagues to betray her trust, no corporate executives to silence her research, no animals suffering while she stood powerless to help. Except today, she hadn't been powerless. Sarah cleaned her bloodied hands at the kitchen sink, studying her reflection in the window. At 43, the mountains had weathered her face and turned her black hair silver at the temples. She looked like someone who belonged to this wild place now, not the polished professional who'd once testified before congressional committees about pharmaceutical corruption. The traps sat on her kitchen table like accusations. She'd seen their kind before, in the early days after her exile, when she still cared enough to document the evidence of other people's cruelty. These were expensive, custom-made. Someone with serious money wanted large predators eliminated from this area. A low rumble from outside made her freeze. It wasn't thunder. The evening sky was clear. Sarah moved to the front window and peered through the glass. Nothing but shadows and swaying pine boughs. Then she saw them. Eyes like molten gold watched her from the edge of the clearing. The bear had followed her home. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she studied the massive silhouette. He favored his injured legs, but he traveled over 2 miles of rough terrain to reach her cabin. Wild animals didn't do that. Injured wild animals definitely didn't do that. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, ignoring every survival instinct screaming at her to stay inside. The beam illuminated the bear's face, revealing an intelligence that made her breath catch. His wounds had stopped bleeding, but he needed medical attention. Without treatment, infection would set in within days. "What are you?" she whispered to the night air. The bear tilted his massive head, as if considering her question. Then, impossibly, he nodded once before melting back into the darkness. Sarah stood on her porch long after he'd vanished, staring at the spot where those amber eyes had been. 15 years of careful isolation, of deliberate disconnection from the world and its pain, had just been shattered by a creature that shouldn't exist. She thought of the electricity she'd felt when he'd touched her, the way he'd remained perfectly still while she'd worked to free him, the almost human intelligence behind his gaze. And now this, following her home, seeking her out with purpose that transcended animal instinct. Sarah Chen had spent 15 years running from her past and the gift that had destroyed her career. But as she finally stepped back inside and bolted the door, she realized that past might have just found her. Tomorrow, she would have decisions to make. Tonight, she would remember what it felt like to matter to something wild and wounded, something that might not be entirely bare at all. The bear's breathing had settled into a steady rhythm by dawn, though Mira still checked on him every hour. She'd managed to drag an old tarp under his massive form during the night, sparing him from the cold ground, but moving him properly would require more strength than she possessed. Instead, she'd built up the fire and wrapped her heaviest blankets around his torso, careful to avoid the bandaged wounds. Now, as pale sunlight filtered through the pine canopy, she knelt beside him with a bowl of warm broth made from the deer bones she kept frozen in her root cellar. The bear's eyes tracked her movements, alert but calm, as if he understood her intentions. "I don't suppose you can sit up," she murmured, setting the bowl aside to check his bandages. The bleeding had stopped, which relieved her, but infection remained a concern. She'd used every antiseptic herb in her stores, golden seal, echinacea, calendula, but treating a creature this size was beyond her experience. The bear made a low, rumbling sound that seemed almost conversational. Mira found herself responding as naturally as if he were human. "The wounds are clean, but you need fluids. Can you lift your head?" To her amazement, the bear raised his massive skull just enough for her to slip her hand underneath, supporting him while she brought the bowl to his muzzle. His tongue, rough and warm, lapped at the broth gratefully. She could feel the vibration of a contented growl through her palm. "Good boy," she said softly, then caught herself. This wasn't some domestic animal she was nursing. This was a wild grizzly, easily 8 feet tall and probably 700 pounds. Yet something about his demeanor suggested an intelligence that went beyond animal instinct. The way he watched her face while she worked, how he seemed to anticipate her movements, the almost human quality of his expressions. A distant rumble made them both freeze. The bear's ears swiveled toward the sound, and Mira felt her stomach clench. She knew that engine, the modified ATV that Jake Morrison used for his backcountry hunting expeditions. The poacher was returning, probably to check his traps. "Stay quiet," she whispered to the bear, though she realized the absurdity of giving commands to a wild animal. Surprisingly, he seemed to understand, lowering his head and going perfectly still. Mira crept to the edge of her clearing, crouching behind a fallen log as the engine noise grew louder. Through the trees, she could see Morrison's stocky figure bouncing on the ATV seat, a rifle strapped to his back. He was heading directly for the trap site. She'd removed the snares last night after freeing the bear, but Morrison would notice their absence. Worse, he'd see the blood trail leading back toward her cabin. Her mind raced through possibilities. She could claim ignorance, say she hadn't seen anything. But Morrison knew these mountains almost as well as she did, and he had a reputation for persistence that bordered on obsession. The engine cut off near the trap site. Mira held her breath, straining to hear over the hammer of her pulse. Morrison's voice carried through the forest, a string of creative profanity that confirmed her fears. He'd found the disabled traps. Minutes passed before the ATV roared to life again. But instead of leaving, Morrison was driving in a search pattern, following the blood trail. The engine sound grew steadily closer. Mira scrambled back to the bear, who was already struggling to rise despite his injuries. She pressed her hands against his shoulder, feeling the tremor of effort in his massive frame. "You can't run in this condition," she said urgently. "Not yet." The bear's dark eyes met hers, and for a moment she felt an odd sensation, as if something was pressing gently against the edges of her thoughts. The feeling vanished so quickly she might have imagined it, but it left behind an inexplicable certainty that the bear understood not just her words, but the danger they faced. The ATV was close enough now that she could hear Morrison calling out, "I know someone's been messing with my traps. Whoever you are, you're going to pay for the pelts you cost me." Mira's cabin sat in a natural depression, partially hidden by dense undergrowth, but Morrison would find it eventually. She'd lived as a hermit for 15 years, avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation. Her nearest neighbor was 20 miles away, and the local sheriff had bigger concerns than poaching disputes in the remote wilderness. The bear made a decision for both of them. With a tremendous effort, he lurched to his feet, swaying but determined. Blood seeped through the bandages, but he took a step toward the thick forest beyond her clearing. "Wait," Mira said, grabbing her medical kit and what remained of the broth. "If you're going to be stubborn about this, you're not going alone." The bear paused, looking back at her with what she could have sworn was surprise. Morrison's voice was getting closer. "Come out now, and maybe we can work something out." Mira shouldered her pack, checked that her fire was safely banked, and followed the wounded giant into the deeper wilderness. The bear's breathing had steadied through the night, though Mira barely slept. She dozed fitfully in her chair beside the makeshift bed, startling awake every time he shifted or groaned. By dawn, exhaustion weighed heavy on her shoulders, but she forced herself upright when she heard him stir. His eyes opened slowly, and she was struck again by their unusual clarity. Most wild animals, even when calm, held a certain unpredictable edge in their gaze. This bear's eyes seemed almost thoughtful. He lifted his massive head slightly, then let it fall back with what sounded remarkably like a sigh. "Easy," Mira murmured, though she wondered if the reassurance was more for herself. "You're safe here." The bear turned his head toward her voice, and she could have sworn she saw recognition flicker across his features, not just awareness, actual recognition, as if he understood not just her tone but her words. She pushed the unsettling thought aside. 23 years of solitude could make a person read human qualities into anything, even a half-dead bear. Moving carefully, she checked his bandages. The bleeding had stopped completely, and the swelling around the trap wounds seemed less severe. Whatever else he was, this bear had remarkable healing abilities. She'd seen animals recover from injuries before, but never this quickly. "You're hungry, I bet?" She stood, her joints protesting after the uncomfortable night. "Let me see what I can find." In her kitchen, Mira rummaged through her supplies. She had some dried salmon, but would that be enough for an animal this size? Her usual preparations for injured wildlife seemed woefully inadequate. She settled on the fish, supplemented with some of her own jerky in a bowl of water. When she returned, the bear was sitting upright. Mira froze in the doorway. The movement should have been impossible given his injuries, yet there he was, alert and watching her with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. The blankets had fallen away, revealing the extent of his muscular frame. Even injured, he was magnificent, easily 7 feet tall and broad enough to fill her small living space. "Well," she said, setting down the food with hands that trembled slightly, "you're certainly feeling better." He sniffed the air, then looked directly at her. For a long moment, neither moved. Mira felt as though she was being evaluated, measured in some way she couldn't understand. Then, deliberately and with obvious effort, the bear lowered himself back down onto the blankets. The gesture felt like a conscious choice to appear less threatening. Mira shook her head, trying to dispel such fanciful notions. She placed the food within his reach and retreated to her chair. The bear ate carefully, almost delicately, which struck her as odd. Most bears she'd observed were messy eaters, but this one seemed mindful of his surroundings, even glancing at her apologetically when a piece of salmon fell onto her blanket. "You're welcome," she found herself saying, then felt foolish for talking to him as if he were human. After eating, the bear settled back down, but he didn't sleep. Instead, he watched her as she went about her morning routine, banking the fire, organizing her medical supplies, checking the weather through her small window. His attention felt different from that of other animals she'd helped. There was a weight to it, an intentionality that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Around midday, she decided to step outside for firewood, needing space to clear her head. The morning's snow had stopped, leaving the world crystal bright and silent. She breathed deeply, letting the familiar peace of her mountain solitude wash over her. But when she turned back toward her cabin, she saw something that made her drop the armload of split logs. Through the window, she could see the bear's silhouette, but it seemed wrong somehow, too upright, too narrow. She blinked hard and looked again, but the angle made it difficult to see clearly. Mira approached the window quietly, her heart hammering. What she saw inside made no sense at all. The bear appeared to be changing. His form seemed to shimmer and shift, as though she was looking at him through water. She rubbed her eyes, certain that exhaustion was playing tricks on her vision. When she looked again, the bear was exactly as she'd left him, massive, dark, and unmistakably ursine. But doubt had taken root. Mira stood in the snow for several more minutes, trying to rationalize what she'd seen. Lack of sleep, stress, the isolation getting to her more than usual. All reasonable explanations. Yet as she gathered her scattered firewood and prepared to go back inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The wounded animal in her cabin was not what he appeared to be, and she was no longer sure if rescuing him had been an act of kindness or the mistake that would finally shatter her carefully constructed solitude. The bear's unusual eyes watched her enter, and this time Mira was certain she saw ancient wisdom looking back. The bear's recovery defied everything Marlowe knew about wildlife medicine. By the third morning, the massive creature was walking without favoring its injured leg, and the wounds that should have taken weeks to heal showed only faint pink lines beneath its dark fur. She'd treated enough injured animals over the years to recognize impossible when she saw it. Standing at her kitchen window, coffee mug warming her hands, she watched the bear lumber around her property with an ease that made her question her own memory. Had the wounds been as severe as she'd thought? The trap had certainly looked brutal enough, its steel teeth caked with blood and fur. The bear paused near her woodshed and turned toward the cabin. Even from this distance, those dark eyes seemed to find hers through the glass. The intensity of its gaze sent an odd shiver down her spine, as if the animal was studying her rather than simply looking in her direction. A sharp knock at her front door shattered the moment. Marlowe's blood chilled. In 15 years of mountain living, unexpected visitors meant only one thing: trouble. She set down her mug and moved to the window beside the door, peering through the gap in her curtains. Two men in expensive outdoor gear stood on her porch, their boots too clean and their jackets too new for serious mountain work. The taller one knocked again, his impatience evident in the sharp rhythm. Behind them, a black SUV sat in her driveway, its engine still ticking as it cooled. "Miss Chen?" The tall man's voice carried the kind of authority that expected compliance. "I'm David Kessler from Apex Mining Corporation. I'd like to speak with you about your property." Marlowe's stomach dropped. She'd been dreading this conversation for months, ever since rumors started circulating in town about mining surveys in the area. Her 40 acres sat in a valley that had been in her family for 3 generations, passed down from her grandmother who'd homesteaded here in the 1940s. She cracked the door open, keeping the chain lock engaged. "I'm not interested in selling." Kessler's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "I understand your attachment to this place, Miss Chen, but perhaps you haven't considered the full scope of what we're offering." He held up a folder thick with papers. "Our geological surveys indicate significant mineral deposits in this valley. We're prepared to make you an offer that would set you up for life. And I'm prepared to tell you that my land isn't for sale." Marlowe started to close the door, but Kessler's boot slid forward, blocking it. "I think you should hear our terms before making any hasty decisions," he said, his tone hardening. "This valley is going to be developed one way or another. You can be part of that process, or you can fight it and lose everything." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Marlowe felt her temper flare, the same fierce protectiveness that had driven her to attack the poachers surging through her veins. "Get off my property." "Miss Chen." please be reasonable." A thunderous roar from behind the men cut off Kessler's words. The bear had emerged from the tree line, standing at its full height on its hind legs. Even from 30 yards away, its size was imposing, easily 8 feet tall with massive shoulders and paws that could crush a man's skull. The second man stumbled backward, his face draining of color. "Jesus Christ, Dave, we need to go!" But Kessler held his ground, though Marlowe noticed his knuckles had gone white where he gripped the folder. "That animal is dangerous, Miss Chen. Fish and Wildlife should be notified immediately." "The only dangerous thing on my property right now is trespassing," Marlowe said. She unlatched the chain and stepped onto her porch, pleased to see Kessler take an involuntary step back. "You have 10 seconds to get in your vehicle and leave before I decide that bear looks hungry." The bear dropped to all fours and began moving toward them with deliberate, measured steps. Its dark eyes remained fixed on the two men, and something in its posture suggested intelligence far beyond normal animal instinct. Kessler's composure finally cracked. "This isn't over," he snapped, backing toward the SUV. "You can't fight progress forever. This valley will be ours, with or without your cooperation." Marlowe watched them retreat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The SUV's tires spun on the gravel as Kessler accelerated down her driveway, disappearing around the bend in a cloud of dust. When she turned back, the bear had stopped just a few feet away. Up close, its sheer size was overwhelming, but Marlowe felt no fear. Instead, she experienced the strangest sensation of being protected, as if this massive creature had deliberately positioned itself between her and the threat. "Well," she murmured, looking into those impossibly intelligent dark eyes, "I guess we both have enemies now." The bear's low rumble might have been agreement, or perhaps something else entirely, something that sounded almost like human speech, too low and rough for her ears to decipher. The first thing Mara noticed when she woke was the silence, not the usual mountain quiet that hummed with wind through pines and distant bird calls, but an absolute stillness that made her skin prickle. She'd fallen asleep in the armchair beside the fireplace, her rifle across her knees, a precaution that had become instinct during her years alone. The bear was gone. The massive form that had dominated her small cabin's main room had vanished, leaving only rumpled blankets and the lingering scent of pine and something else, something wild and indefinably masculine. Mara's hand instinctively went to her rifle as she scanned the room, noting the unlatched front door swaying gently in the morning breeze. She should have felt relieved. The animal was healed, mobile, and had found its way back to the wilderness where it belonged. Instead, an unexpected hollow sensation settled in her chest, as if something important had been torn away while she slept. Outside, fresh snow had fallen during the night, blanketing the world in pristine white. Mara stepped onto her porch, bare feet immediately numbing against the cold planks, and searched for tracks. There, massive paw prints led from her door toward the tree line, but after only a dozen steps they simply stopped, as if the bear had vanished into thin air. A branch snapped behind her. Mara spun, rifle raised, expecting to see the bear returning. Instead, a man stepped out from behind the woodshed. Not just any man. He was tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that caught the morning light and eyes the exact shade of amber she'd stared into for the past 3 days. Those same intelligent, too knowing eyes. "Don't shoot," he said, raising his hands. His voice was deep, rough around the edges like he hadn't used it in a long time. "I owe you my life." The rifle trembled in Mara's grip. This couldn't be happening. Isolation had finally driven her mad, just like her grandfather had warned it would. She was hallucinating, creating phantom men from thin air because her mind couldn't handle the solitude anymore. "You're not real," she whispered. He took a careful step closer. "The trap nearly severed the tendons in my left shoulder. You cleaned the wounds with witch hazel and honey, then stitched them with surgical thread you'd been saving for emergencies. You fed me venison broth and talked to me about your garden plans for spring." Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had done those things, but she'd done them for a bear, not this stranger who moved with predatory grace, despite the heavy bandages visible beneath his torn shirt. "The mining company," he continued. "Blackstone Industries. They want your land." The rifle lowered a fraction. "How do you know about that?" "Because they want mine too." He gestured toward the peaks rising beyond her property. "All of it. The entire watershed." "I don't understand." But even as she spoke, pieces clicked together in her mind. The uncanny intelligence in the bear's eyes, the way it had seemed to understand her words, the impossible disappearance of tracks in fresh snow. "My name is Ronan," he said. "I'm the last of my kind in these mountains, maybe anywhere. What you call shapeshifter, though we had other names in the old tongue." He paused, studying her face for signs of fear or disbelief. "I've been guarding these peaks for longer than you might believe." Mara laughed, a short bark of sound that held more hysteria than humor. "Shapeshifter. Right. And I suppose you're going to tell me you're hundreds of years old and can speak to the trees." "Only 300, Ronan said with the ghost of a smile, "and the trees don't usually have much to say worth hearing." The absurdity should have broken whatever spell held her frozen on the porch. Instead, looking into those amber eyes, Mara found herself believing. Maybe it was the past 3 days of nursing wounds too severe for any normal animal to survive. Maybe it was the way he stood, perfectly comfortable in his nakedness despite the snow, steam rising from his skin as if some internal fire kept him warm. Or maybe it was the loneliness, decades of it, that made her want to believe in magic. "The poachers," she said slowly, "they weren't hunting ordinary game." Ronan's expression darkened. "Blackstone hired them. They know what I am, know I've been preventing their surveys from succeeding. A shapeshifter's hide, heart and bones fetch astronomical prices from certain collectors." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The mining company hadn't just been trying to intimidate her into selling, they'd been trying to eliminate the supernatural guardian that had protected these mountains for centuries. "They'll come back," Mara said. "Yes." Ronan stepped closer, close enough that she could see the golden flecks in his eyes, smell pine and snow and something uniquely him. "Which is why I need your help." The morning brought an unnatural silence to the mountain. Even the usual chorus of birdsong seemed muted, as if the forest itself held its breath. Elena stepped onto her porch, coffee steaming in her hands, and immediately sensed something wrong. The air felt charged, electric with tension she couldn't name. Kodiak emerged from the tree line, his massive form moving with that peculiar grace she'd grown accustomed to. But today, something was different. His ears were flattened against his skull, and his dark eyes swept the forest with predatory alertness. When he looked at her, she saw something almost human in his gaze. A warning. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, setting down her mug and approaching slowly. The bear's attention snapped to the eastern trail, the same path she'd found him on weeks ago. A low rumble built in his chest, not quite a growl but far from contentment. Elena followed his gaze and felt her blood chill. Dust clouds rose above the tree line, too much and too consistent for wildlife. Vehicles, multiple vehicles, from the sound of the distant engines. Elena's mind raced. No one came up here except the occasional lost hiker, and those usually arrived on foot, confused and grateful for directions back to civilization. This was deliberate. This was organized. "We need to get out of sight," she whispered to Kodiak, though she felt foolish talking to an animal as if he could understand tactical planning. Still, when she moved toward the cabin's back entrance, he followed without hesitation. Inside, Elena grabbed her father's old binoculars and positioned herself at the window that offered the best view of the eastern approach. Kodiak pressed against her legs, his massive head level with the windowsill, watching with the same intensity. The first vehicle came into view 20 minutes later, a black SUV with tinted windows, followed by 2 more identical vehicles. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if the occupants were surveying rather than simply traveling through. Elena's stomach dropped when she saw them stop at the exact spot where she'd freed Kodiak from the snares. Men in dark clothing emerged from the vehicles. Even at this distance, Elena could see they were well equipped, carrying what looked like professional gear. One man knelt at the location of the destroyed traps, examining the ground with the methodical attention of a tracker. Poachers returning to check their traps. The thought should have terrified her, but instead a familiar anger kindled in her chest. These were the people who had tortured Kodiak, who had left him to die in agony for the sake of profit. The bear beside her had gone completely still, every muscle coiled with tension. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear the barely controlled sound of his breathing. When she looked down at him, she was startled by the intelligence in his eyes, not the simple awareness of an animal, but something far more complex, something that looked almost like recognition. One of the men began following the trail that led directly toward her cabin. Elena's mouth went dry. She'd been careful to cover their tracks that day, but clearly not careful enough. The man moved with confidence, reading signs in the earth that she couldn't even see from her vantage point. "They're tracking us," she breathed. Kodiak's rumble deepened, and for a moment Elena could have sworn she heard something like agreement in the sound. She needed a plan. The cabin had good sightlines, but it was also isolated, with no quick escape routes if these men meant harm. Her father's old rifle was in the bedroom closet, but she was one person against what looked like a professional operation. As if sensing her thoughts, Kodiak moved away from the window and positioned himself between Elena and the door. The gesture was so clearly protective, so deliberately strategic, that Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with fear. The lead tracker had stopped about halfway up the trail. He was speaking into a radio, gesturing toward the cabin. Elena couldn't hear the words, but his body language was clear. He'd found what they were looking for. "What do they want?" she whispered, more to herself than to Kodiak. But when she looked at the bear, she found him watching her with those impossibly knowing eyes. For a wild moment she imagined he was about to answer, that the rational world she'd built around herself was about to crack open and reveal something far stranger underneath. Instead, Kodiak moved to the back door and looked over his shoulder at her, the message clear. Time to go. Elena grabbed her jacket and the emergency pack she'd learned to keep ready during her years of mountain living. As she reached for the door handle, she heard the distant sound of vehicle doors slamming, followed by voices calling out in coordinated patterns. They weren't just poachers checking traps, they were hunting something specific. And Elena was beginning to suspect that something was the massive bear who had somehow found his way into her heart, bringing with him mysteries she was only beginning to understand. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like gossamer threads when Mara stepped onto her porch, coffee mug warming her palms. The familiar weight of solitude should have settled around her shoulders, but instead she found herself listening for something, footsteps perhaps, or the low rumble of a voice that had grown unexpectedly dear. 3 days had passed since Kieran left, and the silence felt wrong. She'd grown accustomed to his presence faster than she cared to admit, the way he moved through her small cabin without making it feel crowded, how he listened when she spoke about her plants or the mountain's moods, the comfortable quiet that fell between them during meals. Now the empty chair at her table seemed to mock her, and she caught herself preparing portions for 2 before remembering. A sharp crack echoed across the valley, followed by another. Not the natural sound of falling timber, but something mechanical, deliberate. Mara's grip tightened on her mug as she strained to locate the source. The noise came again, closer this time, accompanied by the distant growl of machinery. She ducked inside, grabbing her binoculars from the shelf beside the door. From her elevated position, she could see movement near the old-growth forest that bordered her property. Men in hard hats and reflective vests, orange flags marking trees, equipment she didn't recognize but instinctively distrusted. Her heart hammered against her ribs. They weren't supposed to start for weeks. The legal notices had given her time she'd thought she had to figure out how to fight this. But here they were, surveying, marking, preparing to tear apart everything she'd spent 15 years protecting. One of the men pointed in her direction, and she lowered the binoculars quickly, stepping back from the railing. They'd seen her cabin, knew someone lived up here. How long before they came knocking, clipboard in hand, demanding access across her land for their equipment. She spent the day watching from inside, documenting their movements, counting vehicles, trying to understand the scope of what she was facing. By afternoon, her notebook contained 3 pages of observations and sketches, but no solutions. The weight of helplessness pressed down on her chest like a physical thing. As sunset approached, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, exhaustion finally drove her away from the window. She'd just settled into her chair with a cup of tea when a soft knock came at her door. Mara froze. The workers had left hours ago. She'd watched their convoy disappear down the mountain road. Her nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away and had never visited. For a wild moment, hope fluttered in her chest. She opened the door to find Kieran on her porch, but not as she'd ever seen him before. His clothes were torn and dirty, dark stains that might have been blood marking his shirt. A cut above his left eyebrow had scabbed over, and exhaustion lined his features. But his eyes, those amber eyes that seemed to hold secrets, burned with an intensity that made her step back. "They're moving faster than expected," he said without preamble. "The surveys, the flagging, they're accelerating the timeline. You know about that?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "You've been watching?" "I've been trying to buy you time." He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of pine and something wilder, something that made her think of deep forests and ancient places. "There are things I need to tell you, Mara, things about why they want this land, and why it can't happen." She gestured him inside, noting how he moved more carefully than before, favoring his left side. "You're hurt. It'll heal." He accepted the chair she offered but remained tense, alert, like an animal ready to bolt. The mining company, Blackstone Industries, they're not just after the copper deposits. There's something else here, something they've been searching for across 3 states. What kind of something? Kieran was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if weighing how much truth she could handle. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old secrets. "Your land sits on one of the last nexus points, a place where the barriers between worlds grow thin. They want to exploit that energy, harness it for purposes that would destroy not just the mountain, but the balance of everything connected to it." Mara stared at him, part of her wanting to laugh at the impossibility of what he was suggesting, but something deeper, more primal, recognized truth in his words. She thought of how the mountains spoke to her, how the plants seemed to respond to her touch in ways that defied explanation, how she'd always felt there was something special about this place that couldn't be quantified or sold. "That's insane," she whispered, but even as she said it, pieces began clicking into place. Kieran's sudden appearance, his uncanny knowledge of the mountain's ways, the feeling she'd had since childhood that these woods held secrets. "Is it?" His amber eyes seemed to glow in the lamplight, more insane than a corporation spending millions to access remote mining claims that barely break even. "They know what they're looking for, Mara, and they'll destroy everything to get it." The morning light filtered through the cabin windows as Mira sat at her kitchen table, turning the strange stone over in her palms. It felt warm against her skin, almost alive, and seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Across from her, Kieran watched with an expression she couldn't quite read, part anticipation, part worry. "Tell me about the mine," she said finally, setting the stone down between them. Kieran's jaw tightened. "Blackwood Industries. They've been buying up parcels throughout the valley for months, working their way toward the heart of the forest. Your land sits right in the center of what they want. And what exactly do they want? Rare earth minerals, lithium, the kind of materials that power half the modern world." He gestured toward the stone. "But there's something else here, something they don't understand. The land itself holds power, old power that keeps things in balance." Mira picked up her coffee mug, needing something to do with her hands. "You're talking about magic." "I'm talking about forces that existed long before humans tried to categorize them." Kieran leaned forward, his eyes intense. "The indigenous peoples who first lived here understood it. They knew this place was sacred, that it needed protection. When they were forced out, the responsibility fell to others, to those of us who could sense what was at stake, shapeshifters, among others. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers as he touched the stone. The moment their skin made contact with it simultaneously, Mira felt a jolt of energy race up her arm. The cabin around them seemed to shimmer, and for just an instant she could swear she saw the ghostly outline of massive trees where her walls stood, heard the whisper of ancient voices on the wind. She jerked her hand back, gasping. What was that? The land remembering, Kieran said quietly. You felt it too. Before Mira could respond, the sharp crack of a branch breaking echoed from outside. Both of them froze, listening. Kieran's nostrils flared slightly, and she watched his posture shift into something more predatory. Company, he murmured. Through the window, Mira caught sight of movement between the trees. 3 figures in dark clothing were making their way up the path toward her cabin, moving with the practiced stealth of people who didn't want to be seen. Blackwood's people? She whispered. Kieran nodded grimly. They must have tracked us here. He stood slowly, his movements fluid despite his size. Is there another way out? Mira was already moving toward her bedroom. Back door leads to the root cellar, then to a trail that connects with the old logging road. She grabbed her hiking boots and pack, muscle memory from years of solitary mountain living kicking in. But they'll have people watching the perimeter. Let me worry about that. She turned to find Kieran pulling on his jacket, his face set with determination. Even in human form, there was something fierce about him now, something that reminded her viscerally of the massive bear she'd first encountered in the trap. What about the stone? She asked. Bring it. It's safer with us than here. The sound of heavy footsteps on her front porch made the decision for them. Mira grabbed the stone and followed Kieran toward the back of the cabin. As they reached the rear door, she heard the unmistakable sound of her front door being forced open. They slipped outside into the cool mountain air. Kieran moved ahead of her, scanning the tree line with senses she was beginning to understand were far sharper than any human's. He held up a hand, signaling her to wait, then pointed toward a cluster of boulders about 50 yards away. 2 men, north side. He breathed into her ear. Armed. Mira felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. These weren't just corporate representatives or even private security. These were people who came prepared for violence. Can you get us past them? Kieran's smile was all teeth. Trust me. He began to change before her eyes, his form rippling and expanding. Within moments, the massive bear stood before her, but this time she could see the intelligence in those dark eyes, could sense the man within the beast. He nudged her toward the forest with his great head, then padded silently ahead. They moved through the underbrush like shadows, Kieran's bare form navigating the terrain with impossible quiet for something so large. When they approached the area where the armed men waited, he gestured for her to stay low behind a fallen log. She watched in fascination as he circled wide, approaching the men from their blind spot. One moment the forest was silent, the next shouts erupted from the direction of the boulders. But these weren't cries of pain, they sounded more like terror and confusion. Minutes later, Kieran returned, human again and slightly out of breath. They're running back down the mountain. I may have given them the impression that these woods are home to a very territorial grizzly. Despite everything, Mira found herself smiling. And now? Now we find somewhere safe, while we figure out our next move. He looked back toward her cabin, where voices could still be heard. Because this is just the beginning. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like gossamer threads, and Elena found herself standing at the edge of her clearing, watching Kyle demonstrate something that should have been impossible. He moved between human and bear form as easily as stepping through doorways, his body flowing like liquid mercury caught in moonlight. The old magic isn't gone, he said, settling back into his human shape, steam rising from his skin in the cool air. It's sleeping, waiting for someone who understands that the earth itself has consciousness. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold, but from the magnitude of what he was suggesting. You're talking about communicating with the mountain itself. Your grandmother knew this, Kyle continued, his dark eyes steady on hers. That's why she chose this place. The ley lines converge here, creating a nexus point where the barrier between worlds grows thin. She thought of her grandmother's journals, filled with cryptic references to listening to the stones and speaking the old tongue to the roots. Elena had always assumed it was metaphorical, the poetic musings of an eccentric woman who preferred plants to people. "Show me," she whispered. Kyle smiled, and something wild flickered behind his eyes. "Place your palm against the oak. Breathe with it," he murmured, his voice close behind her. "Feel its rhythm." At first, nothing. Then, gradually, Elena became aware of something deep and slow, a pulse that seemed to originate from the tree's core. Her breathing naturally synchronized with this ancient rhythm, and suddenly she felt it, a vast, patient consciousness that had been watching her for decades. "Little guardian," a voice whispered through her mind, not in words but in feelings, images, sensations. "You have grown strong in your solitude." Elena gasped, stumbling backward from the tree. Kyle caught her shoulders, steadying her. "I felt it," she breathed. "It knew me." "The trees have been watching over you since you arrived," Kyle said. "They've been waiting for you to be ready to hear them." A distant rumble made them both look up. Through the trees, Elena could see dust rising from the access road, heavy machinery moving up the mountain. The mining company was beginning their preliminary surveys. "They'll destroy all of this," she said, anger flaring in her chest. "Every tree, every stone circle, every sacred space." Kyle's expression darkened. "Not if we wake the mountain first." "What do you mean?" "The old protections your grandmother helped establish. They're still here, dormant. If we can activate them, the mountain can defend itself." Elena stared at him. "You're talking about magic, real magic." "I'm talking about partnership," Kyle corrected. "Humans and the natural world working together as they once did. Your grandmother understood this. She helped create a network of guardians across these peaks, people who could communicate with the ancient spirits of place." Another rumble, closer now. Elena could hear the high whine of chainsaws starting up in the distance. Her hands clenched into fists. "How long do we have?" "Days, maybe a week before they reach the core sites." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a familiar coat. She'd spent 20 years hiding from the world, nursing her wounds, convincing herself that solitude was strength. But maybe real strength meant accepting help, accepting connection, with both the land and with this impossible man who'd stumbled into her life bearing ancient gifts. "Teach me," she said firmly. Kyle studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll need to visit the other nexus points, re-establish the connections your grandmother helped forge. It won't be easy. Some of the paths haven't been walked in years. I know every trail on this mountain. These aren't trails you'll find on any map." He gestured toward the forest. "Are you ready to see your mountain as it truly is?" Elena looked back at her cabin, her garden, her carefully ordered world. Then she looked at the rising dust in the distance, at the man whose eyes held centuries of wilderness wisdom, at the ancient oak that had just spoken her name. "Lead the way." They set off into the deep woods, following deer paths that seemed to shift and change when Elena wasn't looking directly at them. Behind them, the sound of machinery grew louder, a mechanical heartbeat that clashed with the mountain's natural rhythms. Ahead lay mysteries that her grandmother had kept hidden, secrets that might be the key to saving everything she'd learned to call home. Elena had spent 2 decades believing she was alone on her mountain. Now she was discovering she'd never been alone at all. The mining equipment arrived at dawn like metal predators crawling across the mountainside. Elena watched from her kitchen window as bulldozers and excavators lined the access road, their yellow hulks gleaming in the early light. Her hands trembled around her coffee mug as she counted them, 12 pieces of heavy machinery, enough to tear through acres of forest in a matter of days. Kieran emerged from the back room, pulling on his flannel shirt. The transformation back to human form still left him slightly disoriented, his movements careful and deliberate. "They're not wasting any time," he said, moving to stand behind her at the window. "The injunction doesn't take effect until the hearing tomorrow," Elena replied, her voice tight. "They're trying to do as much damage as possible before then." Through the glass, they could see workers in hard hats setting up surveying equipment near the tree line, where Elena had first found Kieran in the trap. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The very spot where their worlds had collided was now ground zero for the corporation's assault. "I should go down there," Kieran said, his jaw clenched. "Make them understand what they're dealing with." Elena turned to face him, seeing the barely contained wildness in his amber eyes. "As what? A man with no legal standing? Or a bear that'll end up on the evening news?" Before he could answer, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed up the mountain road. Elena's heart sank as she recognized the white SUV in the lead, Thomas Whitmore's company vehicle. Behind it followed 2 more trucks filled with what looked like additional security personnel. "He's coming here," she whispered. Kieran's expression darkened. "Let him come." The convoy pulled into Elena's driveway with the casual arrogance of trespassers who believed they owned everything they surveyed. Thomas stepped out of the lead vehicle, straightening his expensive suit jacket as if he were attending a board meeting rather than invading someone's home. The security team fanned out behind him, their presence clearly intended to intimidate. Elena opened her front door before Thomas could knock, unwilling to let him think he had any power over her domain. "You're on private property." "Miss Marchetti," Thomas smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "I thought we should have another conversation, clear up any misunderstandings before tomorrow's hearing." "There's nothing to discuss." Elena stepped onto her porch, Kieran close behind her. She noticed how the security team's attention immediately focused on him, as if sensing something dangerous despite his human appearance. Thomas's gaze flicked between them. "I think there is. You see, we've had reports of unusual animal activity in this area. Attacks on our equipment, damage to our preliminary survey markers." His smile widened. Large predator tracks that seemed to appear and disappear without explanation. Elena felt Kieran tense beside her, but her own expression remained steady. "Wildlife doesn't respect your survey markers, Mr. Whitmore. Maybe that should tell you something about where you don't belong." "Or maybe," Thomas continued, his tone growing colder, "someone is orchestrating these incidents, using trained animals, perhaps. That would constitute criminal interference with a legal mining operation." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Elena realized this wasn't just about intimidation. Thomas suspected something, even if he didn't know what. The corporate executive who dealt in facts and figures was grasping for an explanation that would fit his worldview, unable to comprehend the ancient forces he was truly facing. "Are you accusing me of something specific?" Elena asked. "I'm offering you one last chance to be reasonable." Thomas pulled a folded document from his jacket. "A purchase offer, triple the previous amount, with a clause that allows you to remain on a portion of the property as a tenant." Elena didn't even look at the papers. No. Thomas's facade finally cracked, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "Then you'll lose everything. The injunction will fail, and we'll take the land through eminent domain proceedings. You'll get a fraction of what I'm offering now, and you'll have nothing to show for your stubbornness but legal fees." She won't be alone in that fight. The voice came from the edge of the clearing, where an elderly man emerged from the forest path. Elena blinked in surprise as she recognized Jake Morrison, followed by Sarah Chen and 3 other neighbors she hadn't spoken to in years. They approached with determined expressions, clearly having witnessed the confrontation from the woods. "The entire valley's watching this," Sarah added, her camera visible around her neck. "And we're not impressed by corporate bullying tactics." Thomas looked genuinely surprised for the first time. his confidence wavering as he realized the scope of opposition forming against his operation. The isolated mountain woman he'd expected to intimidate easily had somehow become the center of a growing resistance. "This changes nothing," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "The law is on our side." As the corporate convoy retreated down the mountain road, Elena felt something shift in the morning air. Not just the promise of the coming battle, but the unexpected warmth of community support she'd forgotten was possible. The mining equipment arrived at dawn, a convoy of steel beasts that carved deep ruts into the mountain road. Elena watched from her kitchen window as the massive trucks lumbered past, their diesel engines coughing black smoke into the crisp morning air. Her coffee cup trembled in her hands. "They're early," she murmured to herself, though she knew Kieran could hear her from wherever he was in the cabin. Over the past weeks, his supernatural hearing had become both a comfort and a reminder of just how different their worlds were. Heavy footsteps crossed the wooden floor behind her, and she felt his presence before his reflection appeared in the window glass beside hers. Even in human form, Kieran carried himself with the silent power of his bare nature, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for someone his size. "The ritual site isn't ready," he said quietly, his breath fogging the glass. "I need at least another day to prepare the proper offerings, to call the old spirits back to the mountain." Elena turned to face him, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. She'd learned to read these subtle signs of his inner turmoil over the weeks they'd spent together, preparing for this moment that had arrived too soon. "Then we buy you that day," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Kieran's dark eyes searched her face. "Elena, you can't seriously be thinking of confronting them directly. These aren't local hunters or small-time poachers. Blackwater Mining has lawyers, security teams, government contracts. And I have something they don't." She moved to the old oak chest in the corner of the room, pulling out a leather folder she'd hoped never to open again. Legal ownership of this land going back 4 generations, with mineral rights clearly specified in the original deed. She spread the yellow documents across her kitchen table, watching Kieran's expression shift from concern to something approaching hope. "My great-great-grandfather was a shrewd man," Elena continued, running her finger along the faded ink. "He knew what lay beneath these mountains, and he made sure his family would have a say in what happened to it. Blackwater thinks they've bought mining rights from the county, but the county never had the authority to sell them." Kieran studied the papers, his finger tracing the same lines she'd memorized during sleepless nights. This could work in court, but legal battles take months, years. They'll strip mine half the mountain before the first hearing. Elena felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest, the same feeling that had driven her to retreat from the world years ago. The thought of facing corporate lawyers, of standing in courtrooms and fighting battles in the public eye, made her palms sweat. But then she looked at Kieran, really looked at him, and saw something she'd never expected to find in another being. Someone who needed her as much as she needed him. "Then we don't wait for court," she said. "We make our stand here today." The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and through the window they could see the orange and yellow of construction equipment beginning to position itself at the base of the mountain. Kieran moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "If we do this, there's no going back. Once I perform the ritual, once the mountain's true guardians awaken, everything changes. The boundary between the human world and the old world will thin here permanently." Elena understood what he wasn't saying, that she would be tied to this place not just by choice and inheritance, but by magic itself, that the solitude she'd sought here would be replaced by something else entirely, a responsibility to protect not just the physical land, but its spiritual essence. "And what about after?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "When the mountain is safe, when your duty is fulfilled, will you stay?" The question hung between them, like morning mist, fragile and crucial. Kieran's hand found hers among the scattered papers, his calloused fingers intertwining with her smaller ones. "I've been alone for longer than you can imagine," he said, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm, wandering between shapes, between worlds, belonging nowhere. "But here, with you," he paused, seeming to struggle with words that felt too large for his throat. "You saved me from more than just those traps, Elena." Before she could respond, the rumble of machinery grew deafening. Through the window, they watched as the first excavator positioned itself at the tree line, its massive bucket glinting in the sunrise. Elena squeezed Kieran's hand, drawing strength from the connection between them. "Then let's save each other," she said, "and everything else worth saving." Together they gathered the legal documents, Kieran's ritual supplies, and what remained of their quiet morning. The mountain was calling them to its defense, and they would answer. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like ghostly fingers as Elena made her way down the treacherous path toward the mining camp. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each step bringing her closer to a confrontation she'd spent decades avoiding. Behind her, Kieran moved with the fluid grace of his bare form, his massive paws finding purchase on rocks that would send a human tumbling into the abyss below. They paused at the ridge, overlooking the corporate encampment. Below them, yellow machinery carved ugly wounds into the earth, while men in hard hats directed the systematic destruction of what had been pristine wilderness just weeks ago. The sound of diesel engines and grinding metal assault her ears, a mechanical symphony that spoke of profit over preservation. "There," Kieran rumbled, his voice carrying even in his shifted form. "The silver trailer with the satellite dish. That's where Donovan will have the survey reports and the legal documents." "I still think we should wait for the lawyer," she whispered, though they both knew time was a luxury they couldn't afford. The morning shift had already begun blasting operations on the eastern slope, each explosion sending tremors through the ancient root systems that held the mountain's secrets. Kieran's dark eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw not the bear but the man, wounded, determined, carrying centuries of loss in his gaze. "Elena, by the time lawyers finish arguing, there won't be anything left to save. Besides," his muzzle curved in what might have been a smile, "you're not facing this alone anymore." The truth of those words settled into her bones, steadying her resolve. For 30 years she'd hidden in these mountains, nursing old wounds and avoiding the complications that came with trusting others. Now, watching this ancient guardian prepare to risk everything for her land, their land, she felt something she'd thought buried forever: hope. They descended separately. Elena took the winding service road, her story prepared, a concerned landowner seeking clarification about property boundaries. Kieran melted into the forest shadows, positioning himself where he could intervene if negotiations turned hostile. The camp bustled with activity, nobody sparing a glance for the woman in worn hiking boots and a faded flannel shirt. Elena had deliberately chosen clothes that made her look like a local eccentric rather than a threat. She approached the silver trailer with measured steps, her grandfather's surveying maps tucked inside her jacket. "Mr. Donovan?" She knocked on the trailer's aluminum door, her voice carrying just enough uncertainty to seem harmless. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I'm Elena Clearwater, and I believe there might be some confusion about the property lines up here." "Ms. Clearwater," he said with practiced charm, "I'm afraid there's no confusion. Meridian Industries has full legal authority to proceed with resource extraction on this site." "I see." Elena pulled out her grandfather's hand-drawn map, letting her fingers shake slightly as she unfolded it. "It's just that my family's been up here for a very long time, and according to our records, some of your operation might be extending onto our property." Donovan's expression shifted, wariness replacing condescension. "Your property? 7 generations," she said quietly. "My great-great-great-great-grandmother, Sarah Clearwater, homesteaded here in 1847. We've never sold a single acre." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant rumble of machinery. Elena could practically see the calculations running behind Donovan's eyes. Legal challenges, potential delays, profit margins threatened by unforeseen complications. Even if that were true, he said finally, any claims would have been resolved during our environmental impact assessment. We researched all existing property rights before beginning operations. Did you? Elena reached into her pack and withdrew the translated documents, their pages yellowed with age but their meaning crystal clear. Because according to these tribal agreements and territorial claims, properly filed with the Bureau of Land Management in 1923, this entire mountainside is held in perpetual trust. Donovan's face went pale as he scanned the documents, his legal training clearly recognizing the potential catastrophe they represented. Behind his shoulder, Elena caught a glimpse of maps and charts covering every surface of the trailer's interior. These documents will need to be authenticated, he stammered. Of course, Elena smiled, finally allowing steel to enter her voice. I've already contacted the appropriate authorities. They should be here by noon. The helicopter's rotors sliced through the morning air like a mechanical predator, casting shadows that swept across the meadow where Mira and Kai had shared their first kiss just hours before. She pressed herself against the rough bark of an ancient pine, her heart hammering as the aircraft circled lower, searching. Corporate security, Kai whispered beside her, his human form tense with barely contained rage. They're not waiting for the legal proceedings. Through the trees, Mira could see armed men rappelling from the helicopter, their movements precise and military-trained. These weren't local deputies or even federal agents. Blackstone Mining had brought in private contractors, the kind who asked no questions and left no witnesses. How many? She breathed. 6. Maybe more in reserve aircraft. His eyes had taken on that golden shimmer that preceded his transformation. Mira, I need you to get to the cave system near Devil's Ridge. There are passages there that lead... I'm not running. The words came out harder than she intended. This is my land, my fight. Their fight, he corrected, gesturing toward the mercenaries now fanning out through the forest. You don't understand what Blackstone is capable of, what they've done to other communities who stood in their way. She turned to face him fully, seeing the fear in his ancient eyes, not for himself, but for her. And you don't understand what you've given me. For 30 years I had nothing worth dying for. Now I do. The crack of breaking branches echoed through the forest as the search party moved closer. Radio chatter filtered through the trees, cold and efficient voices coordinating their sweep. The old mining surveys were wrong, Mira said suddenly, a desperate plan forming. What if we could prove that? What if the rare earth deposits thereafter don't actually exist here? Kai's expression shifted from protective alarm to sharp focus. The surveys from the 1940s? I found them in my grandfather's papers, but there might be older records, geological surveys that predate Blackstone's claims. She gripped his arm. You said you've been here for centuries. What do you remember about mining attempts? About what's actually buried in these mountains? His eyes closed for a moment, and she could see him reaching back through decades of memory. There was silver mining in the 1880s, but they stopped abruptly. The miners claimed they hit something that made their equipment malfunction, made them sick. Not rare earths, Mira whispered. Something else entirely. A shout echoed through the forest, closer now. One of the mercenaries had found their abandoned campfire from the night before. We need to move, Kai urged, but Mira was already pulling her satellite phone from her pack. Sarah, she said when her lawyer answered, I need you to halt any legal proceedings immediately. File an injunction claiming environmental contamination concerns. Mira, what are you talking about? Where are you? The mining surveys from the 1940s get them to independent geological consultants. I think we've been looking at this all wrong. The sound of boots on forest floors getting closer. Whatever's in this mountain, it's not what Blackstone thinks it is. She ended the call and turned back to Kai, who was staring at her with something approaching awe. You're going to fight them with paperwork while they're hunting us with assault rifles? I'm going to fight them with truth. She shouldered her pack. But first, we need to survive long enough to prove it. A rifle shot cracked through the morning air, the bullet splintering bark inches from Mira's head. They ran, crashing through underbrush as shouts erupted behind them. Kai's hand found hers, his inhuman strength helping to pull her up steep slopes and across treacherous ravines. "The old mine shaft," she gasped, "near Widow's Peak. If what you remember is true, it's dangerous. The tunnels are unstable. More dangerous than them?" Another shot rang out, closer this time. They broke from the tree line onto a rocky outcropping, and Mira could see the dark mouth of the abandoned mine below them. But between them and Sanctuary, 3 mercenaries had emerged from a parallel trail, weapons raised. "Mira Chen!" the lead man called out, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You're trespassing on property designated for federal acquisition. Stand down." Beside her, Kai's breathing had changed, becoming deeper, more animal. She could feel the wildness rolling off him in waves, the ancient predator preparing to protect what was his. "This is still my land," she called back, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "You're the trespassers." The mercenary's smile was cold and professional. "Not for much longer. Miss Chen, you have 10 seconds to surrender, or we'll be forced to consider you a hostile environmental terrorist." Mira felt Kai's hand tighten around hers, felt the tremor that meant his control was slipping. In moments, he would transform, would tear through these men with claws and fangs, and there would be no coming back from that, for either of them. She closed her eyes and made her choice. The mining equipment arrived at dawn, a convoy of trucks that shattered the mountain's morning silence. Elena watched from her cabin window as the yellow machines crawled up the access road like mechanical locusts, their diesel engines belching black smoke into the pristine air. Her coffee mug trembled in her hands. "They're early," she whispered, though she'd known this day would come. The injunction had only delayed the inevitable for 3 weeks. Kyle emerged from the bedroom, his human form solid and warm in the morning light, but she could see the wildness flickering in his amber eyes. The bear in him was agitated, pacing beneath his skin like a caged animal. He moved to stand behind her, his large hands settling on her shoulders. "The old protections are failing," he said, his voice rough with worry. "I can feel the mountain's pain as they cross the threshold. Each truck that passes tears another hole in the barrier." "The other guardians?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Are they coming?" Kyle's silence stretched too long. When he finally spoke, his words fell like stones into still water. "Most are gone, Elena. Centuries of human expansion, of development and destruction. Some died fighting to protect their territories. Others simply faded when the wild places they guarded disappeared beneath concrete and steel." She turned in his arms, seeing the ancient grief etched in the lines around his eyes. "How many?" "I've sensed perhaps a dozen across the entire continent, scattered, weakened, many lost in hibernation so deep they may never wake." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "I'm likely the last guardian with enough strength to attempt the Great Binding." The Great Binding. They'd spoken of it in hushed tones over the past weeks, an ancient ritual that could strengthen the mountain's natural defenses, but at a cost neither wanted to voice aloud. Elena understood the theory now. Kyle would need to merge completely with the land itself, becoming one with stone and stream, root and ridge. He would live on, in a sense, but not as the man who held her in his arms each night. A thunderous crack echoed across the valley as the first trees fell to the clearing crews. Elena flinched as if the sound were a physical blow. Through the window she watched ancient pines topple like matchsticks, their massive trunks hitting the earth with bone-deep thuds that vibrated through the cabin floor. "There has to be another way," she said fiercely, gripping the front of his flannel shirt. "I didn't find you just to lose you to this mountain." Kyle's smile was heartbreaking in its tenderness. "You didn't find me, heart of mine. We found each other. And what we've built together, what we've discovered, that won't disappear even if I must change form again." "Don't." Elena pressed her fingers to his lips. Don't talk like you've already decided. We still have time to think of something else. And what about my hunger? The words tore from her throat before she could stop them. What about what lies beneath the surface of this? She gestured between them. Whatever this is we've built, do I get no say in whether you sacrifice yourself for the greater good? His amber eyes flared with something wild and desperate. In the morning light streaming through the window, she could see the exact moment his human composure cracked. The careful control he maintained over his dual nature slipped, revealing the raw need beneath. You think this is easy for me? His voice dropped to a growl that raised goosebumps along her arms. You think I want to leave you? Elena, you brought me back to life. For 300 years I was more bear than man, forgetting what it meant to hope, to love, to dream of a future beyond mere survival. You gave me back my humanity just in time to lose it again. Outside, another tree fell, and with it, Elena felt something shift inside her chest. The fear and helplessness that had paralyzed her since Meridian's arrival crystallized into something harder, more focused. She might be just one woman against a corporate giant, but she was a woman who'd spent 20 years surviving in these mountains. A woman who'd freed a massive bear from steel traps with nothing but determination and bolt cutters. The morning air crackled with tension as Vera adjusted the rifle strap across her shoulder and checked the ammunition one final time. Through the cabin window, she could see Kieran pacing the clearing in his human form, his massive frame taut with barely contained energy. The transformation from bear to man still took her breath away, but today she had no time to marvel at the magic. They'll come from 3 directions, Kieran said as she stepped outside. His voice carried the authority of centuries. The main logging road, the old mining trail, and they'll try to flank us from the ridge. She'd spent 40 years alone on this mountain, and the thought of losing it, losing him, ignited something fierce in her chest. Then they've underestimated what they're up against. The sound of engines echoed from the valley below, growing closer. Kieran's head snapped toward the noise, nostrils flaring as his bear senses kicked in. 12 vehicles, maybe 30 men. His jaw clenched. I should have called more of my kind. We work with what we have. Vera shouldered her pack, heavy with supplies and makeshift explosives. Besides, you said the old magic is strongest here. Use it. A grim smile crossed his face. You're remarkable, you know that. Heat flushed her cheeks, but she turned away before he could see. After decades of solitude, his words still caught her off guard. Save the sweet talk for after we win. They moved through the forest with practiced silence, Vera's knowledge of hidden paths combining with Kieran's supernatural awareness. The first group of intruders was already advancing up the logging road, their heavy boots and casual conversation carrying through the trees like a dinner bell to predators. Vera positioned herself behind a fallen log, while Kieran melted into the shadows between 2 massive pines. The lead mercenary was a scarred man in tactical gear, speaking into a radio with casual confidence. No sign of resistance yet. The old woman probably ran when she heard us coming. She almost snorted. Old woman indeed. Her finger found the trigger as she sighted down the barrel. The first shot shattered the morning quiet. Not to kill, she wasn't ready to cross that line yet, but the bullet sparked off a rock inches from the leader's head. The men dove for cover, shouting orders and raising their own weapons. This is private property, Vera's voice boomed across the clearing. Turn around and leave. Gunfire erupted in response, bullets thudding into the log that sheltered her. She rolled left, found new cover, and returned fire. These weren't weekend hunters fumbling with borrowed rifles. These men moved with military precision, flanking her position with disturbing efficiency. A roar split the air, not human but something primal and ancient. Kieran emerged from the tree line in his bare form, 8 feet of pure fury crashing through their ranks. Men scattered like leaves, their tactical formation dissolving into chaos as a creature from nightmares materialized among them. She sprinted up the mountain, using deer trails invisible to outsiders. Her lungs burned, but 40 years of this terrain had built endurance that surprised even her. Behind her, she could hear Kieran fighting, the terrible sounds of claws against metal, human shouts of fear and pain. The ridge trail emerged exactly where she expected. The flanking team was picking their way through the rocky outcrop, focused on reaching the cabin from above. They never saw her coming. The first homemade explosive, just fertilizer and diesel fuel in a mason jar, rolled down the slope like a wayward stone. The explosion sent rocks tumbling and men diving for whatever cover they could find. Before they could regroup, she'd already moved to a new position. There, on the ridge. Bullets whined off granite as she ducked and weaved between boulders. Her radio crackled, Kieran's voice strained but alive. Eastern approach neutralized, moving to support. Negative. She gasped into the device. Guard the cabin. They're trying to reach the survey stakes. The corporate documents she'd seen made it clear. Blackstone needed those boundary markers to prove their legal claim. Without them, their mining rights meant nothing. A bullet creased her shoulder, spinning her around. Pain flared, but she kept moving. Below, she could see more vehicles arriving, reinforcements streaming up the mountain. The odds were getting worse by the minute. But, as her boots found purchase on familiar stone, as the mountain itself seemed to rise beneath her, Vera felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. The mining equipment roared to life at dawn, diesel engines shattering the mountain's ancient silence. Elena stood at her cabin window, watching the convoy of trucks snake up the access road like metal parasites. Her hands trembled against the glass as the first excavator lurched into position near the old growth stand. "They're early," Kieran said from behind her, his voice heavy with exhaustion. The transformation back and forth was taking its toll. She could see it in the shadows beneath his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged even in human form. 3 hours early, Elena's jaw tightened. They want to get as much done as possible before the protesters arrive. The sound of splintering wood echoed across the valley as the first tree fell. A massive pine that had weathered 2 centuries of storms crashed to the forest floor with a finality that made Elena's chest ache. Birds erupted from the canopy in panicked clouds. "I have to try again," Kieran said, already moving toward the door. "If I can disrupt their equipment—" "You nearly collapsed last night." Elena caught his arm, feeling the tremor of exhaustion running through his muscles. "You've been shifting too much, too often. Your body can't take much more." "My body will endure what it must." His dark eyes held hers with fierce determination. "This land has protected my kind for millennia. I won't let it fall to their greed." Another tree crashed down, closer this time. Through the window, Elena could see workers in hard hats marking more giants for destruction. The sight sent a surge of rage through her veins, so powerful it made her dizzy. "There has to be another way," she whispered. Kieran's expression softened. He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs tracing the worry lines that had deepened over the past weeks. "You've done everything possible through legal channels. Sometimes the old ways are all that's left. The old ways will get you killed." The words came out sharper than she intended. "What happens to this land if something happens to you? What happens to—" She stopped herself before she could say "to me," but the words hung unspoken in the air between them. His smile was gentle and heartbreaking. "Nothing will happen to me." But Elena had learned to read the uncertainty flickering behind his confident facade. She'd seen how the mining company's security had increased, how they'd brought in armed guards and motion sensors. They were prepared now for the mysterious bear that had been sabotaging their operations. "I'm coming with you," she said. "Absolutely not. You can't stop me." Elena pulled away from his touch, moving to the gun cabinet. "This is my land too, my fight too." "Elena." His voice carried the rumble of his other nature, a warning that might have intimidated anyone else. But she'd stared down charging bears and weathered 20 years of isolation. She wasn't backing down now. "I know these mountains better than any of their security team," she said, checking her rifle with practiced efficiency. I know every game trail, every hiding spot. You need me." Before he could argue further, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through their conversation. Elena peered out to see trucks pulling up her drive. Not mining company vehicles, but battered pickups and old SUVs. Car doors slammed and familiar voices called out, "Elena, you in there?" She stepped onto the porch to find Marcus Chen climbing out of his truck, followed by nearly a dozen other locals. Sarah emerged from another vehicle with a backpack full of supplies. Even old Henrik was there, leaning heavily on his walking stick, but his eyes bright with purpose. "What are you all doing here?" Elena asked, though warmth was already spreading through her chest. "Heard the bastards started early," Marcus said, shouldering his own rifle. "Figured you might need backup." "We've been organizing," Sarah added, pulling cameras and recording equipment from her pack. "If we can't stop them legally, at least we can document everything. Make sure the world sees what they're destroying." Henrik stepped forward, his weathered face grave. "My grandfather told me stories about these mountains, about the spirits that guard them." His eyes found Kieran, standing silent in the doorway. Some of us still remember the old agreements. Elena felt Kieran's surprise ripple through their bond. The old man knew, perhaps not the specifics, but enough to understand that something ancient and powerful called this place home. "This is dangerous," Elena warned them all. "They have armed security." "So do we," Marcus replied grimly. "And we have something they don't. We know why we're fighting." Another tree crashed in the distance, followed by the grinding roar of heavy machinery. The sound galvanized the group like a battle cry. Elena looked back at Kieran, seeing the wonder in his expression as he took in these humans willing to risk everything for his ancient home. "Looks like you're not fighting alone after all," she said softly. For the first time in days, Kieran smiled with genuine hope. "Then let's go save our mountain." The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as Maya pressed herself against the rocky outcropping, her heart hammering against her ribs. Below in the valley, she could see the mining trucks forming a convoy, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like predatory eyes. They were moving faster than anticipated, pushing toward the sacred grove where Kieran waited. She'd left him there an hour ago, his massive bear form standing sentinel among the ancient trees. The ritual to awaken the mountain's protection required him to remain in that exact spot until sunrise, vulnerable and unable to shift back to human form. The timing had seemed perfect when they'd planned it. Dawn would break just as the legal injunction took effect, stopping the mining operation permanently. But someone had tipped off Blackstone Corporation. Someone had told them exactly when and where to strike. Maya's radio crackled. "All units, move to position 7. Target is isolated and contained." Her blood turned to ice. They weren't just here to mine. They were here for Kieran. She scrambled down the mountainside, her boots sliding on loose scree. 30 years of navigating these slopes gave her an advantage, but the mining crews had night vision and numbers. As she dropped into the tree line, she could hear boots crushing through the underbrush behind her, voices coordinating her pursuit. The sacred grove lay in a natural amphitheater, ringed by standing stones that predated any human settlement. Kieran stood motionless at its center, his massive frame silhouetted against the altar stone. Ancient words in a language she barely understood rumbled from his throat, the sound vibrating through the earth beneath her feet. She could feel the mountain responding, a deep thrumming that seemed to pulse with life. "Kieran," she whispered harshly, but he couldn't break the ritual now, not when they were so close. Flashlight beams swept the grove's perimeter. She counted at least 8 men, all armed, moving with military precision. At their head walked Marcus Blackstone himself, his silver hair gleaming in the artificial light. "There's our problem," Blackstone said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. 30 years of blocked permits, environmental challenges, and mysterious equipment failures. All because we never dealt with the real threat. Maya's mind raced. The tree line offered cover, but not for long. The ritual needed 15 more minutes. She could feel it in the mountain's pulse, still building toward something greater. But 15 minutes might as well be 15 hours with armed men closing in. She made a decision that would have terrified her even a week ago. Standing up from her hiding place, she walked into the grove with her hands visible. "Looking for me, Marcus?" The men spun, weapons rising, but Blackstone held up a hand. His smile was cold and satisfied. "Maya Chen. I should have known. 30 years you've been a thorn in my side, filing your little complaints and organizing your protests. I never imagined you were harboring an actual supernatural entity." "He's not a thing to be harbored," Maya said, stepping closer to Kieran. The bear's chanting never wavered, but she could sense his awareness of her presence. "He belongs to this mountain. He is this mountain." "Yes, well, that's exactly the problem." Blackstone gestured to his men. "Did you know there are government contracts for capturing and studying creatures like your friend here? Very lucrative contracts, enough to make the mining operation seem like pocket change." The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't about stopping the ritual. It was about capturing Kieran alive. Someone had told Blackstone exactly what he was. Behind Kieran, the altar stone began to glow with soft green light. The mountain's pulse was accelerating, responding to the shapeshifter's call. Maya could feel something vast stirring beneath her feet, ancient beyond measure and utterly protective of what it considered its own. "You're too late," she said, surprise filling her voice as she realized it was true. "Look around you, Marcus. Really look." Blackstone frowned, then slowly turned. The standing stones were beginning to resonate, a low harmonic that made the air itself shimmer. Between the stones, shadows moved that weren't cast by any earthly light. The very trees seemed to lean inward, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the stars. "The mountain is awakening," Maya whispered, "and it knows you don't belong here." One of the mercenaries raised his weapon toward Kieran, but his hands were shaking. The rifle trembled as an unseen force pressed down on all of them. Maya felt it too, a presence so old and powerful that her mind could barely process it. But unlike the armed men, she felt welcomed by it, embraced. "Fall back," Blackstone ordered, his voice cracking. "Fall back now!" But the trees had shifted, closing off the paths they'd used to enter. The grove had become a living trap, and the mountain itself was deciding who deserved to leave. Kieran's chanting reached a crescendo just as the first rays of sunlight broke over the eastern peaks, and Maya felt the world change forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the meadow, where Elena knelt beside the ancient oak, her fingers tracing the symbols that Kieran had carved into its bark weeks ago. The protective wards hummed with quiet energy, a testament to the magic that now flowed freely through her land. Below in the valley, where Blackstone Mining's equipment had once scarred the earth, wildflowers pushed through the healing soil. "The aspen grove is showing new growth," Kieran's voice came from behind her, warm and familiar. She turned to find him approaching with 2 steaming mugs, his human form solid and real in the golden light. "The spirits say the salmon will return to the upper creek by next spring." Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma that mixed with the pine-scented air. "I never imagined it could heal so quickly." She gestured toward the valley. "When I first saw those machines tearing into the mountainside, I thought it would take decades to recover." "The land remembers what it was before," Kieran said, settling beside her on the moss-covered ground. "It just needed the poison removed and the old protections restored." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining naturally, much like people sometimes. Elena smiled at that, thinking of how different she felt now compared to the suspicious, isolated woman who had first discovered a wounded bear in her trapline. The walls she'd built around her heart had crumbled as surely as Blackstone's foundations, leaving room for something she'd never dared hope for. A rustling in the underbrush announced the arrival of other forest dwellers. A red fox emerged first, followed by a family of deer who showed no fear as they grazed nearby. Word of the mountain's renewed protection had spread throughout the supernatural community, drawing creatures she'd only heard whispered about in her grandmother's stories. "Marcus called yesterday," Elena said. watching a raven land on a low branch and cock its head at them intelligently. The federal investigation is moving forward. Apparently, Blackstone's been cutting corners on environmental protections for years. They'll be tied up in court for the foreseeable future. And their mining rights here? Officially revoked. Elena couldn't keep the satisfaction from her voice. Turns out their permits were based on falsified geological surveys. The land's been designated as protected habitat. Kieran squeezed her hand. Your grandmother would be proud. The Whispering Peaks will remain wild for future generations. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the morning unfold around them. Elena marveled at how natural this felt, sharing coffee and conversation with an ancient shapeshifter who could transform into a 1,000-pound bear. Her old life of solitude seemed like a half-remembered dream, grey and distant compared to the vibrant reality of loving and being loved in return. There's something I want to show you, Kieran said eventually, rising and extending his hand. Elena followed him deeper into the forest, along paths that seemed to open before them and close behind, guided by magic older than human memory. They emerged at a hidden clearing she'd never seen before, despite 30 years of exploring these mountains. A natural amphitheater of stone surrounded a crystal-clear spring, its waters reflecting the sky like a mirror. Ancient petroglyphs covered the rock walls, spirals and animal forms that seemed to move in her peripheral vision. This is the heart of it all, Kieran explained, his voice reverent. Where the first guardians made their pact with the mountain spirits, the source of the magic that protects this place. Elena approached the spring slowly, feeling the power thrumming in the air around her. It's beautiful. She knelt at the water's edge, seeing her reflection waver alongside Kieran's. Why are you showing me this? Because the guardians have always worked in pairs, he said softly. The magic is strongest when shared between two hearts that beat as one. I've protected these peaks alone for centuries, but the spirits have been waiting for something, for someone, to complete the bond. Elena's breath caught as understanding dawned. You're asking me to become a guardian too? I'm asking you to be my partner in all things, Kieran replied, moving to kneel beside her. To help me protect this land we both love, to share the long years ahead, to build a life together that honors both solitude and connection. Elena looked into the spring's depths, seeing not just their reflections, but glimpses of possible futures. Seasons turning, forests growing, a small cabin filled with laughter and love. The loneliness that had defined her for so long felt like a stranger's memory. Yes, she whispered, and the words seemed to resonate through the clearing, awakening something profound in the ancient stones. Yes to all of it. Kieran's smile was radiant as he cupped her face in his hands. Their kiss tasted of coffee and morning air and promises kept. Around them, the forest sang its approval, and Elena finally understood that sometimes the greatest adventures began not with leaving home, but with opening your heart wide enough to let the wild magic in.